I was scrolling through YouTube the other day and I kept getting hit with these videos. You know the type. A guy in a crisp iron shirt standing in front of a whiteboard talking about 10 stoic secrets to crush your competition.
Oh yeah, I know exactly the ones you mean.
He was selling Stoicism as this ultimate corporate survival kit, right? A way to become unshakable, emotionally invulnerable, like some kind of productivity-boosting app for your brain. He kept using words like control and indifference, painting this picture of a perfect, ice-cold executive who never flinches at a bad quarter. But then I clicked on one. And about 30 seconds into his talk on why suffering is a choice, an ad played, a really sappy one, for a phone company or something.
Okay.
And when the video came back, the guy's mic was off. For a full 10 seconds, you could just see him talking, getting visibly more and more agitated.
Oh no, you could see it.
Yeah, totally. When the sound finally cut back in, he was mid-rant, completely flustered, blaming his useless software.
Wow. That image just stuck with me. This guru of unshakable calm, totally undone by a simple tech glitch, it felt like.
Yeah.
Like a complete misunderstanding.
Exactly. Because when you actually read the originals, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, you don't get the sense they were cold robots at all.
Not at all. You get the sense they were men on the absolute edge, overthinkers trying desperately not to implode.
Right. Their philosophy wasn't an armor to win meetings. It felt much more like a tourniquet, just something to survive the day.
That is the core insight, I think. We absolutely have to recapture that because the modern narrative, especially the pop psych version, often strips away that original, intensely therapeutic function.
Totally. We're left with this superficial idea of just, being indifferent instead of the deep, really difficult work of emotional self-regulation.
Right. And the sources really show us that this philosophy wasn't designed for the average, easygoing person. It seems like it was really aimed at those managing intense internal overload and extreme external demands.
So that's what we're diving into today. The contemporary relevance of Stoicism, but viewed as maybe a robust cognitive behavioral framework, specifically for people who might identify as highly sensitive, to manage that emotional overload and, frankly, prevent burnout in this crazy, overstimulating world we live in.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that Stoicism's power might actually lie in its rigor, its demanding nature, and that rigor is perhaps necessary for individuals whose internal systems are kind of naturally set to high alert.
So we're moving beyond the shiny image of the unshakable executive.
Yeah, way beyond that, and more into the reality of the person who just experiences the world so intensely.
That story about the flustered YouTube guru, it feels so relatable, right? Because we all feel this constant state of overload, too many notifications, too much bad news, just the sensory assault of a busy city.
Absolutely. But our sources point us toward a specific psychological concept that kind of formalizes this intense internal and external reaction. It's called environmental sensitivity.
Okay, environmental sensitivity. So let's establish what exactly that means, maybe beyond just feeling stressed or burnt out. How is it formally defined in, psychological terms?
Well, formally, environmental sensitivity is defined as the capacity of individuals to perceive and process external stimuli. But here's where it gets broader and really useful for our discussion.
Okay.
It doesn't just cover the obvious external stuff, noise, light, the room you're in. It fully includes internal stimuli as well.
Like where?
Like your own feelings, your thoughts, even body sensations, pain, thirst, hunger, that kind of thing.
Right.
And then looking outward again, it also includes the social environments.
So like other people.
Exactly. Things like picking up on other people's subtle moods or shifts in group dynamics or just navigating complex interpersonal relationships. It covers all of that.
Wow. Okay. That makes it a really comprehensive measure then of how much the world, both the outside world and your internal world, really gets into you.
That's a good way to put it.
So it's not just about, say, jumping at a loud noise. It's maybe about still feeling stressed about a conversation you had 3 days ago.
Precisely. And what's really crucial to understand here is that high sensitivity to environmental influences is, it's a minority construct.
Meaning not everyone experiences the world this way.
Right. Estimates suggest that only a small percentage of the population, the numbers range a bit, maybe between 10% and 35%, are considered highly sensitive.
So if you fall into this group, Your experience of the world, its complexity, its demands, even its joys, is just significantly more acute than most people's.
You're fundamentally wired to process things differently and often, yeah, more deeply.
Okay, that immediately gives us a specific group of people for whom a philosophy built on extreme self-control and detachment, like Stoicism, wouldn't just be interesting, but potentially vital, like for mental survival.
That's the connection we're exploring.
So to get more specific on who these individuals are, we probably need to look at the sensory processing sensitivity, or SPS framework. This trait is often called the highly sensitive personality, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
What are the signature sort of measurable traits that distinguish this type of temperament?
So the SPS framework views high sensitivity as basically a biological trait. It's associated with a strengthened environmental influence, like we said, and it's characterized by 4 distinct measurable aspects that kind of differentiate this personality type.
Okay, 4 aspects. What's the first one?
The first is depth of processing.
Depth of processing. Tell us more about that. Like, what does that look like in daily life?
This is the tendency to engage in really complex, extensive cognitive analysis. It's like your brain's internal software is running every situation through multiple permutations, multiple what-ifs.
Ah, okay. The classic overthinker.
Sort of, yeah. If you're the person who lies awake, analyzing every conversation replay from the day, spotting subtle patterns or potential consequences that others seem to miss, you're likely operating with deep processing.
And it's not just curiosity.
No, it feels more like a cognitive imperative. Like you have to analyze it thoroughly before you can move on, before acting or responding.
So that overthinker tendency isn't necessarily a flaw then, it's actually a fundamental part of the definition, but it sounds, well, cognitively demanding, exhausting maybe.
It absolutely is exhausting. Which leads directly to the second aspect, the ease of overstimulation.
Makes sense.
Yeah, given that combination, the wide intake of all kinds of stimuli, plus the depth of processing required for each piece of input, these individuals tend to get overwhelmed by environmental stimuli very quickly.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine walking into a busy coffee shop. For someone high in SPS, it's not just the general noise. It might be every conversation, the specific smell of the coffee grounds, the flickering lights overhead, the subtle mood shift you notice in the cashier, plus your own internal list of tasks you have to do. All of it is being fully processed and analyzed simultaneously.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for nervous system overload. Rapid burnout.
Exactly. That massive input leads to rapid overload and, rapid burnout.
And that feeling of rapid burnout is arguably like the defining mental health challenge of our modern digital era, right?
Yeah.
Constant input, no downtime.
It really is.
Okay, so deep processing, easy overstimulation. What about the emotional side? Does deep processing correlate with the deep feeling?
It absolutely does, which brings us neatly to the third aspect, emotional reactivity.
Okay.
These individuals tend to show really strong, intense responses to both positive and negative stimuli.
So it's not just negative.
No, not at all. They often feel joys and connection very intensely, which can result in high levels of empathy, deep appreciation for beauty, things like that. But that same intensity means they also experience distress, stress, anxiety, and depression much more acutely, especially when the environment is negative or hostile.
So a minor criticism, for example, could feel genuinely devastating.
We really could. If the world often feels like a constant assault, that high reactivity must be tremendously difficult to manage day to day.
Yeah, no kidding. And the fourth aspect.
And finally, there's a heightened awareness of subtleties. They possess this really high perceptiveness for minor details in the sensory environment, the physical space, and the social world.
Like picking up on vibes.
Kind of, yeah. Picking up on nuance, the slight inflection in someone's voice, a micro-expression on a friend's face that others miss, the specific way a room is organized or feels. They tend to be excellent observers.
But I can see how that feeds back into the other traits.
Exactly. It feeds back into the depth of processing. It creates this sort of positive feedback loop for gathering input, you notice more details, but potentially a negative feedback loop for managing the cognitive load. You just have more to process.
Okay, so this combination, deep analysis, easy overwhelm, intense emotional swings, both high and low, and this high awareness of everything. It really does sound like a potential recipe for chronic distress, especially if you live in a complex, demanding environment like the modern world where there often isn't much space for subtlety or slow reflection.
That is the crucial paradox of high sensitivity.
Yeah.
And it brings us to a really important concept called differential susceptibility. It's sometimes summarized as the for better or for worse dynamic.
Okay, for better or for worse. What does that mean?
Well, standard psychological models, like the older diathesis stress model, might suggest high sensitivity is solely a risk factor. You're just more vulnerable, more likely to suffer if things go wrong.
Right, that sounds intuitive.
It does. But the differential susceptibility idea, based on environmental sensitivity research, suggests these individuals are fundamentally more responsive to all environmental influences, both the negative and the positive ones.
Okay. So if a highly sensitive person is stuck in a bad, chaotic environment, say a toxic job or a really stressful family situation, they probably suffer significantly more than the average person would in that same situation.
This is a for worse part, yes.
But what about the flip side? If they are placed in a constructive, supportive, or maybe even just a well-structured environment?
They flourish disproportionately. They can accelerate past their lower sensitive peers in terms of benefiting from that positive environment. This potential to really maximize positive outcomes is known as vantage sensitivity.
Vantage sensitivity. Okay, I like that term.
Yeah, it means that the highly sensitive individual is more likely to take advantage of and benefit dramatically from positive conditions or, importantly, effective interventions.
So this is the crucial reframing moment for you, the listener, right? High sensitivity isn't a disorder, it's a trait.
Exactly. It's a trait that carries definite psychopathology risks when the environment is negative, sure. But it simultaneously carries specific benefits like profound empathy, increased awareness, and intensity of positive experience when the environment is supportive and provides the necessary structure or tools.
That makes the connection to Stoicism incredibly clear now. It's like
Right.
the same deep analysis and high reactivity that makes life painful in a chaotic world is the same powerful engine that makes them accelerate when they're given the right philosophical structure and support.
Precisely.
It takes us directly to Stoicism, which is essentially one giant, highly structured cognitive framework. And it seems designed to manage exactly this kind of intense emotional and cognitive fuel.
Exactly right. Stoicism, especially when you strip away that, corporate hustle disguise.
Yeah, the whiteboard version. Right. It's actually a deep cognitive resistance strategy. It's fighting against the very symptoms of high sensitivity we just talked about. The high reactivity, the deep processing, the ease of overstimulation. The founders, they weren't aiming for emotional emptiness. They were trying to achieve a state of rigorous inner control against what felt like a constant internal storm.
So what was the primary objective then? Philosophically speaking, what were they aiming for?
The objective was human felicity, often defined as eudaimonia, which in the Stoic context really meant tranquility, contentment, and a fundamental calmness of mind.
Peace, essentially.
Yes, peace. And critically, it meant freedom from anxiety. And, maybe more specifically, freedom from those insatiable, destructive desires that can really derail you. To achieve this state, the Stoics cultivated something called apatheia.
Okay, and we have to be careful here, right?
Yeah.
Because that word, apatheia, it often gets mistranslated into modern English as apathy, suggesting like cold uncaringness.
Exactly. That's a common misunderstanding.
So if the Stoics weren't cold robots, what did they actually mean by apatheia?
Apatheia literally means not suffering. It's the state of being free from the apathy, which were seen as the destructive, irrational emotions. Things like excessive fear, uncontrollable rage, or consuming lust that tend to seize and control the mind.
So it's not indifference to the world itself.
No, not at all. It's
Yeah.
indifference to the emotional turbulence that the everyday world can cause. The goal was achieving a kind of emotional detachment, enough detachment to allow the individual to judge situations clearly based on reason, rather than being completely swept away by intense feeling.
Okay, that makes so much more sense, especially for the highly sensitive person who experiences all those sensations, the fear, the joy, the desire, often with overwhelming intensity. Apatheia then becomes the ultimate therapeutic target, a place where feeling doesn't automatically equal suffering.
Exactly. Reframe Stoicism entirely. It's not about feeling less. It's about making sure your feelings don't compromise your ability to reason clearly and act virtuously.
Right, so the Stoic tenets then become almost like a literal antidote, or at least a management strategy for the highly sensitive temperament. Let's break those down. Starting with that deep vulnerability highly sensitive people often feel towards the external world.
Absolutely. That's the foundation. Tenet number 1 is indifference to externals.
Okay.
The core teaching here is that peace and contentment cannot come from placing high value on things outside of our immediate internal control.
Like what sort of things?
Things like wealth, power, reputation, even your physical health or your body, because fortune is fickle, right? Things change. The Stoics recognized that if your happiness relies on unstable external environments,
Which are the very environments the highly sensitive person is acutely responsive to.
precisely, then you are pretty much doomed to unhappiness or at least constant anxiety. By consciously practicing indifference to those externals, you are essentially removing the massive emotional weight that the highly sensitive person might otherwise place on social approval, material conditions, or things just going perfectly.
That's the classic Stoic dichotomy of control, right? Filtering out the noise, focusing on what's yours.
Exactly.
But okay, controlling your reaction to the external world is one thing. Controlling the reactive internal world that feels like another beast altogether, especially for that deep processor type who can generate huge amounts of anxiety from just a single thought. How does Stoicism address that intense cognitive noise?
That's the second core tenet, and honestly, probably the hardest work of Stoicism.
Yeah.
Proper judgment of impressions.
Proper judgment of impressions.
Meaning, this is where reason is applied as internal therapy. The idea is that our happiness or unhappiness depends not purely on the event itself, like you're getting a critical email, having a flat tire, whatever, but on how we judge our perception of that event.
So it's the story we tell ourselves about the event.
Exactly. The Stoics taught us to assent to truth, dissent from falsity, and try to remain neutral or objective about things that are, in themselves, morally indifferent, neither good nor evil. Seneca was really unambiguous on this. He basically said everything hangs on one's thinking. Reason is the antidote to wrongful opinions or bad judgments.
Okay, so if a sensitive person's depth of processing often leads to rumination, and rumination often involves catastrophic thinking, which is essentially wrongful judgments based on fear, then reason is the tool you use to try and correct that internal software error.
That's the goal.
But how do you actually catch the judgment? Especially when the emotional reaction can feel so fast, almost instantaneous for someone highly reactive.
That's the practice. You have to cultivate the pause. The goal is literally catching that initial thought or impression, as they called it, and consciously questioning the judgment embedded within it before the resulting passion. The anger, the fear, the despair spirals out of control.
That active scrutiny.
Yes, and that leads directly to the third tenet, which tackles the emotions or passions themselves. Subordination of passion to reason.
Right, and this is where critics of Stoicism often jump in, isn't it? They argue it's just not possible. I think David Hume famously argued reason is merely the slave of the passions.
Right, that's a very famous critique.
So if you're intensely reactive by nature, how can pure reason possibly compel you to, excise a really strong emotion like anger or deep fear?
Yeah, that's a critical point of friction, and the Stoics definitely acknowledged the intensity of passion. They didn't pretend it was easy. They taught that passions possess us if they are left unchecked.
And the highly sensitive person often feels possessed by their strong emotional reactions, right? Like they're being hijacked.
Exactly. So the Stoic solution is demanding, no doubt about it. Reason must superintend these emotions. The aim is to dampen them, and if possible, ultimately excise the destructive ones. Seneca, for example, in his dialogue on anger, argued pretty forcefully that anger doesn't just start as some involuntary spasm. It starts, he claimed, with a decision, a moment of assent.
A choice.
A choice. His point was, we are not merely victims of our passions. We have the capacity, at least in theory, to choose whether to approve or not approve of a passion taking hold.
Okay, that moment of choice, that tiny pause you mentioned between the stimulus and the response, that sounds like the entire battleground, especially for someone prone to quick overstimulation. What's the technical term for that capacity for self-control, for actually exercising that choice?
The term they used is encresia. It basically means self-control or self-mastery.
Encresia?
Yeah. It's the core concept of having control over oneself, the ability to act according to your own will and your conscious best interest, even when you're facing the strong pull of passion or ingrained habit.
And the Stoics were pretty firm that we have this ability.
Their position is quite unambiguous. We possess this capacity for choice. And that idea is crucial, psychologically, for the highly sensitive person who's trying to manage that rapid onset of emotional reactivity. If you feel easily overwhelmed and driven by external stimuli or internal feelings, the doctrine of encresia offers a philosophical justification to reclaim your agency. It asserts that you are not purely defined by the intensity of your feelings. You have a say.
And this isn't just about making a single decision in a crisis, is it? It sounds more like a commitment to well, fundamental character change over time.
Absolutely. It's a long-term, persistent strategy. The ultimate Stoic goal is shaping one's constitutional character, as they might put it, over time to achieve lasting happiness and tranquility. And that involves persistent, almost athletic practice. It's not passive.
Like training a muscle.
Exactly like training a muscle. If you want to resist giving in to fear or rage consistently, you have to practice saying no to those specific impulses, constantly, day after day, until the self-controlled, rational response becomes more habitual, more automatic. It's very much a philosophical training regimen.
Okay, so this philosophical framework gives us the why, the goal of tranquility, and the what, indifference, proper judgment, subordination of passion. Now let's get practical and look at the how. Does modern psychological research actually confirm that applying this kind of disciplined approach works, especially for the sensitive individual?
Yeah, let's look at that.
Because if we take that concept of vantage sensitivity seriously, we should see these individuals benefiting more from this kind of structure.
Right, and we do. This is where the synthesis gets really powerful, I think. Modern research strongly suggests that the intense emotional reactivity characteristic of highly sensitive people actually makes them more receptive to these types of structural, disciplined interventions.
So their sensitivity isn't just a vulnerability, it's also a receptivity.
Exactly. Their characteristic high responsiveness cuts both ways. Potentially high suffering and chaos, but accelerated healing and growth when provided with structure and support.
That's the vantage sensitivity kicking in. The very trait that might cause intense suffering in a bad environment acts as an accelerator for recovery and growth when the environment, or maybe the philosophical toolkit, is good.
Precisely. We see this vantage sensitivity in action quite clearly in, for example, resilience programs studied in adolescents.
Okay, tell me about that.
Well, one excellent example is the Spark Resilience Program. It's based on cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT techniques, which have a lot in common with Stoic practices. This program focuses on fostering protective factors, things like self-efficacy, believing you can do things, self-esteem, and crucially self-regulation skills.
Which, if you look closely, sound an awful lot like modern translations of Stoic virtue, right? Self-control, rational assessment.
They really do. And the key finding.
What were the results for the sensitive participants in that program?
The studies demonstrated that the highly sensitive adolescents who participated in Spark, when compared to their low-sensitive peers in the same program, showed a significantly greater promotion of self-esteem and a more significant reduction in depression symptoms.
So the intervention worked better on them?
Disproportionately better, yes. It confirms the idea. When Stoic-like practices focusing on internal control and emotional regulation are introduced in a supportive context, that high sensitivity trait seems to act as an accelerator for positive change.
It really validates that analogy you sometimes hear. The highly sensitive brain is like highly fertile soil. If you plant weeds like negative experiences or chaos, they grow really rapidly. But if you plant constructive seeds like self-regulation techniques or a solid philosophy, they also grow rapidly and strongly.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, let's move to some of the specific cognitive tools that modern therapy uses, which seem to share direct DNA with Stoic philosophy. How do we deal with that depth of processing when it spirals into unproductive rumination?
Right, the overthinking trap. We use structured problem-solving techniques. For the deep processor, rumination is often deep, yes, but it's also aimless processing that just goes in circles and leads nowhere, causing distress.
So structure is the key.
Structure is key. Structured techniques help turn that exhaustive analysis into productive action by breaking down the difficulty into manageable steps. Typically, these techniques follow about 5 sequential phases.
Okay.
Like general orientation, what's the issue? Precise definition of the problem, then generating alternative solutions, making a decision about which to try, and finally verifying the results. Did it work?
That sounds very methodical.
It is. And that structured approach helps reduce the psychological discomfort because it gives the ruminative mind a concrete, finite task to focus on. It's a direct countermeasure to that endless, unproductive mental cycling.
Okay, and what about the Stoic correction of wrongful judgments? You know, identifying those irrational fears and false beliefs that cause so much suffering. How does modern psychology mirror that approach?
That is addressed directly through cognitive restructuring. It's a cornerstone of therapies like rational emotive behavior therapy, RABD, developed by Albert Ellis, who actually acknowledged his debt to Stoicism.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah. RAPD is really focused on identifying and then modifying those irrational, intrusive thoughts that drive negative emotional responses. In practice, this often involves paying special attention to our internal imperatives, those thoughts formulated with absolute terms.
Like what?
Like thoughts containing must, should, ought, or have to. For instance, I must succeed at this, or things have to be fair, or using absolute descriptors like always or never. This always happens to me. I'll never figure this out.
That aligns perfectly with the Stoic principle of correcting wrongful judgments, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The goal is to root out those false beliefs that Seneca and Epictetus warned us about, like the belief that externals are inherently good or bad, or that the world somehow owes us a certain outcome.
Exactly. If, as the Stoics believed, so much hangs on our thinking, on our judgments, then cognitive restructuring is like the necessary wrench you use to adjust that thinking software when it's malfunctioning.
Okay, but the highly sensitive experience of overstimulation isn't just mental, right? It's often deeply physical, too. They suffer from what the research calls high ease of excitation, EOE, and a low sensory threshold, LST, meaning they get triggered easily and overwhelmed quickly by sensory input.
That's right. The body's very much involved.
So how do we address that body-mind connection when it comes to sensory overload? We need strategies that build physiological resistance, not just mental ones.
Absolutely. And one strategy that shows promise involves consistent physical exercise.
Exercise? How does that help with sensory overload specifically?
Well, research has shown that increasing the frequency of physical exercise can actually moderate the relationship between depressive symptoms and those sensitivity traits, the ease of excitation and the low sensory threshold.
That's a really powerful finding. But how does physical activity like, going for a run or hitting the gym make someone less prone to sensory overwhelm? What's the mechanism?
The proposed mechanism is habituation. Think about it. When participants frequently engage in intense physical exercise, they are voluntarily exposing themselves to strong stimuli.
Like what?
Like loud music in a gym, physical discomfort, the burning tension in your muscles, a high pounding heart rate. Over time, this controlled voluntary exposure seems to help raise the body's baseline sensory processing threshold.
So your nervous system gets used to a higher level of arousal.
Exactly. It gets accustomed to operating at a higher state of arousal without triggering an immediate fight or flight or overwhelmed state. It's essentially using controlled physical stress to build physiological resilience against other kinds of sensory and psychological stress.
That sounds incredibly stoic in practice, voluntary discomfort leading to resilience.
It really does, doesn't it? Practiced by other means.
Okay, so that's the more active approach. What about the quieter, maybe more internal strategies for the body-mind connection?
Right. Well, psychosomatic techniques like mindfulness or yoga are known to be highly effective complements, especially for this group.
Mindfulness seems relevant here.
Very much so. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR programs, for instance, are consistently shown to improve mood states and, crucially, attention control. And this seems particularly beneficial for highly sensitive individuals.
How does it help with the sensitivity aspect specifically?
Well, high levels of what's called dispositional mindfulness, the ability to maintain present moment, non-judgmental attention, were found to dramatically moderate the association between high sensory processing sensitivity and anxiety.
Okay, so it acts like a buffer.
Exactly. It offers a perfect mental antidote. If high sensitivity often leads to intense rumination, that anxious cognitive loop focusing on past regrets or future fears, mindfulness practice actively pulls your focus back to the immediate controllable present moment. It directly counters that core ruminating tendency that fuels anxiety.
So it functions as a powerful shield against the mind's tendency to amplify distress.
A shield, or maybe an anchor to the present.
Okay, now let's just quickly revisit that philosophical sticking point we touched on earlier. That skepticism about whether reason alone is truly sufficient to control deep-seated passions. If critics like Hume have a point, but we know the Stoics themselves often managed to achieve profound internal control, what was their secret sauce? Was it just pure willpower?
That's a great question. I think the Stoic success, when it occurred, was likely achieved by integrating reason with what we might call a toolbox of complementary factors.
A toolbox.
Yeah. Reason might be necessary to identify the virtuous path, to make the right judgment, but it's often insufficient on its own to actually compel action, especially against strong emotion or habit.
So what else is in the toolbox besides reason?
Things like intuition, maybe imagination, visualizing outcomes, sheer persistence, learning from experience, developing specific skills, and crucially, building habit through consistent practice. These tools, working in conjunction with the philosophical understanding, are what enable us to act incarnatically, to actually do what we know is in our long-term best interest, even when it's hard.
Okay, so it's reason plus these other character strengths and practical skills. We probably need to see these principles in practice, right?
Right.
Applied during an extreme crisis to really understand their power.
Absolutely. Let's look at the story of Jason Regier. He faced a complete and sudden loss of control, the ultimate test, and his story really illustrates how he applied this kind of stoic toolbox to survive and eventually thrive.
Okay, tell us about Jason Regier.
Jason Regier was, by all accounts, a vibrant college soccer player, also studying philosophy, interestingly enough. At age 21, he was in a severe Jeep accident. The accident instantly rendered him quadriplegic, paralyzed from the neck down. So in a moment, he went from being this independent, athletic young man with his whole future seemingly mapped out to losing all use of his body, losing his independence.
That's devastating, just unimaginable.
Absolutely. Lying alone in the hospital, faced with the total shattering of his life's path, he naturally fell into a deep, paralyzing depression. He's spoken about being in the darkest possible space, where, understandably, suicidal thoughts frequently occur.
That is the ultimate test of the Stoic framework, isn't it? The total loss of pretty much everything Seneca and Marcus Aurelius would have labeled an external. Health, physical ability, control over your daily life, maybe reputation, future prestige, all gone in an instant.
Exactly. The rug pulled out completely. But as he lay there, his mind, which remember was trained in philosophy, began the slow work of introspection and objective analysis.
Even in that state.
Apparently so. His first unexpected cognitive shift, as he tells it, was actually an act of gratitude.
Gratitude in that situation.
Yeah. He realized it could have been even worse. He wasn't brain damaged, for instance. He saw others in the hospital who were perhaps born with their injuries or had less support. This seemingly simple mental act, consciously choosing gratitude amidst absolute devastation, that is the Stoic judgment in action. Deliberately reframing the impression, refusing to assent to the idea that the tragedy was absolute and unmitigated evil.
Wow. He was literally making his world survivable by controlling his perception of it, even when the external facts were just horrifying.
And from that initial tiny foothold of internal control, he moved to the classic Stoic dichotomy of control we talked about. He realized that his recovery, his future happiness, depended entirely on his mindset and his ability to see things as they really were, a kind of radical acceptance of his new reality.
Okay.
So he began to apply the principle of focusing only on what he could still influence. He made this devastating yet objective calculation. He said something like, before the accident, maybe I could do 10,000 things, but now I can only do maybe 100.
100 out of 10,000. That's a staggering loss. Most people, I imagine, would fixate entirely on the loss of the 9,900 things.
Of course. But Jason made the vital mental shift, a pure act of encrasia, of self-control over his focus. He asked himself, essentially, why not just focus on maybe 20 of the 100 things that I can still do and focus on doing those 20 things perfectly or as well as I possibly can?
So he narrowed his focus dramatically.
Dramatically. Yeah. He focused on the smallest, most immediate controllable actions, trying to maintain a positive mental state, learning how to direct his own care effectively, finding reasons, however small, to persist each day.
That shift from fixating on the vastness of the loss to maximizing the intensity and quality of the remaining tiny points of control, that is the core Stoic tenet of remaining indifferent to externals, translated into an immediate practical survival mechanism.
Absolutely. It was an act of pure, persistent will, fueled by his philosophical understanding. By focusing relentlessly on those precious few things he could control and choosing his attitude and direction every single day, he was able to use his philosophical training and his persistence, his whole toolbox, to climb out of that depressive state.
And what happened to him?
Well, today, Jason is an incredible example of Stoic success in the face of adversity. He went on to get an MBA, he's traveled the world, run a business, and perhaps most famously, he won a gold medal for the United States in quad rugby at the 2008 Beijing Paralympics.
Wow. That's incredible. His story really demonstrates that these principles aren't just abstract ideas. They can work not just to manage the sort of daily overwhelm of modern life, but to actually survive existential, character-defining crises.
It really does.
It feels like his experience shows that Stoicism gave him the structure, the belief system, the why, and his character, his persistence, his will, the toolbox, provided the means to actually execute it day after day. The combination is undeniable in its power.
It's the ultimate testament, I think, to the effectiveness of viewing Stoicism, not as this pursuit of, emotional invulnerability or corporate coolness, but as a rigorous therapeutic approach. especially suited, perhaps, to managing a highly reactive temperament. Its true power seems unlocked when it's applied by or for the individual whose emotional life is inherently intense and potentially overwhelming.
Okay, so if we bring the two main strands of this deep dive together, then the highly sensitive individual on one side and this disciplined philosophy of Stoicism on the other, we really do find a kind of perfect synergy, don't we?
It certainly looks that way.
The individual who is highly sensitive potentially gains the most significant benefit from a disciplined philosophy like Stoicism, precisely because their vantage sensitivity maximizes the positive impact of learning psychological self-mastery.
That's the argument, yes. The philosophy provides the targets, indifference to externals, proper judgment, the ultimate goal of tranquility through apatheia. And then the modern psychological practices, we discuss things like CBT techniques, habituation through exercise, mindfulness. They provide the immediate tangible tools, the how-to for cultivating the daily habits needed to actually reach those philosophical targets.
So it's the combination of the philosophical rigor and the practical application that makes this framework so potentially potent today?
I think so.
But we also have to be realistic, right? If we're going to rely on this as a genuine survival tool, we have to acknowledge that historically, Stoicism was often seen as just too hard for most people.
That's true.
The Roman Stoic creed was sometimes criticized even back then for being kind of cold and impersonal. And the sources suggest it partly failed to become more widespread because of its sheer difficulty, and maybe its over-reliance solely on the individual's will, which, as we all know, is easily depleted.
That difficulty is absolutely still the hurdle today. To make this demanding athletic philosophy work long-term, especially for highly sensitive people who are perhaps more easily depleted by overstimulation in the first place, we know they probably need more than just the cold, impersonal creed, more than just the books.
They need support.
It seems likely. To cultivate the necessary habits and skills consistently, they probably need both the philosophical targets and a supportive environment, whether that's formal counseling, a like-minded community, regular physical practice like yoga or exercise, or simply creating a safe, structured space in their own lives to breathe and practice that crucial pause between stimulus and response.
So Stoicism, viewed in its full original context, really isn't a corporate strategy for crushing the competition at all.
Not fundamentally, no. It looks much more like a genuine, demanding, potentially life-saving survival tool, especially perhaps for the sensitive soul trying to navigate an increasingly overwhelming world.